Before we get started, from now until May 22nd, I am running a giveaway for a free signed copy of The Littlest Elephant by Katherine Applegate. Follow the link in the description and subscribe there to enter. Must be within the United States to be eligible to win. And thank you for listening. Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week we have an interview with Katherine Applegate, author of The One and Only Ivan, Crenshaw, and many, many other books for young readers, including her newest title, Wombat Waiting, releasing on May 5th. Next week we will have another episode covering the newest book releases as well as another interview next Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date in the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with this week's interview. Katherine, thank you so much for being here today. Can you start us off with just introducing yourself and the book that we'll be discussing today?
Of course, I'm delighted to be here. I am Katherine Applegate, a.k.a. K.A. Applegate, once upon a time. And I am here to talk about my new middle grade novel with HarperCollins called Wombat Waiting.
And what is the story of Wombat Waiting?
Well, I guess I should make it clear from the outset, it is not, in fact, about a wombat. A wombat is a kind of fuzzy Australian creature. And this particular dog that we're focusing on in this story, it just looks a lot like a wombat, and the nickname sticks at some point. It's actually set and loosely based on the time period in January 2025 when Southern California experienced some horrific fires, not the first, not the last. Specifically, the Eaton Fire, which was in Altadena, and the Pacific Palisades Fire. And I wanted to talk about climate change. I wanted to talk about, that kind of natural disaster, but in a way that would be soft enough, gentle enough, accessible enough that a younger reader, like a third, fourth grader, could handle it. And the best way to do that, I thought, was to talk about a dog. I also wanted to talk about this particular kind of dog. I call her a destiny dog. And for dog lovers out there, I'm sure I'm sure you have encountered many rescues along the way. I've rescued plenty of dogs, but a destiny dog is a little bit different. A destiny dog finds the person with whom she's meant to be. And Wombat ends up hearing a voice inside her head saying that way, and it directs her right into the maelstrom, the fire that's going on. And of course, that creates some serious complications. But she knows somewhere out there is somebody she needs to be with.
And I wanted to ask specifically about the voice, because the voice is treated as its own character, being given the proper name Voice with a capital V. And interestingly enough, books tend to be not spoken out loud when they're not audiobooks. And so I wanted to ask you, what does the voice that is speaking to Wombat sound like to you as the author?
Well, she describes it as the echo of wolf song, meaning it's in Wombat's head, it's clear as a bell. To me, I think of it more as a reminder, particularly to young readers, that we have voices inside of us, that speak to our hearts, that matter, and that we have to listen to those sometimes. And sometimes when we listen to those voices, other people will tell us, no, that's not right. That's not who you are. That's not what you're meant to be. And I wanted to talk about that in a way that might be accessible to a kid.
What are some ways that a reader might be able to interpret that voice? Like you said, it's kind of a guiding voice that reminds them of what they're supposed to be. What are some examples a young reader might come up with in their own life of this kind of voice and what they can do to kind of be led by it to the best outcomes.
One of the things I've been doing a lot when I go on book tour is telling kids to embrace their weird because I think as you're growing up, there is incredible pressure to be just like everybody else. And social media certainly has made that even more of a profound problem for kids. And what I tell them is that the creatives I know, I'm sure you've had this experience, are, to a person, weird, and I mean that in the best possible way. We look at the world differently. We think outside the box, and that's a good thing. That's how the most magical stories unfold when you do embrace that part of yourself that sees the world a little bit differently. So, I think for kids, it's really important to remember, especially as you veer toward middle school, um, that remaining who you really are meant to be is very, very important.
And Catherine, I wanted to talk a little bit about the very real tragedy that inspires the events of Wombat Waiting, that being the 2025 wildfires. As you said, not the first, will not be the last. In Wombat Waiting, in the very early parts of the book, it is said that wildfires are a natural and necessary part of an ecosystem. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and maybe a little bit about some of the research that went into writing this book?
Well, it's of course part of the natural world that fires do end up creating renewal. The problem is with climate change, we are experiencing long and devastating droughts. The Before January 2025, I think it had been about 8 months with virtually no rainfall. And then you add to that the Santa Ana winds, which in Los Angeles are remarkably strong. If you've ever been there, it's almost like an entity. People, Joan Didion and others have written about it. It's so strange that these 80-mile-an-hour winds are veering down the mountains, and it's warm, and it feels completely unnatural, and it's part of the way things work in that part of the world, but when you have, uh, so many people crammed, into a smaller and smaller, you know, e encroaching on the wild areas, it's so much easier for a fire to start, and that's exactly what happened. Um, it's in the natural world, of course, we have, fires that happen, but we don't have the kind of, civilization, as it were, taking over more and more of the world.
And one thing that's really important in writing for young readers is including real world topics that can sometimes be really powerful and something that's really impactful to children's lives, even if it's not directly. Climate change is one of those major topics that need to be discussed with young people, and they need to learn about so that they can grow up being sustainable, knowledgeable, uh, conscious of the environment, and being able to write for young readers typically means having younger characters. Wombat Waiting shows us a younger character, but also has us following a dog who, similar to a young person, has very little impact on the world around them. Can you talk a little bit about writing such a serious topic like climate change for young people using the lens of the young human in the book and also the dog who seemingly won't be able to affect it as much of anything in the world around them?
I do think that's one of the reason that, kids love books about animals. It has to do with power dynamics, the powerlessness that they often feel, around, the crazy adults who are allegedly running things. And you're absolutely right that Wombat is completely powerless, but as it turns out, there are ways even she can affect, the the outcome of this really devastating fire. She ends up in a place that is essentially a shelter, and although she's a canine curmudgeon who wants nothing to do with other people. People are gravitate toward her, as they will with dogs, and she ends up providing a lot of comfort. And that can be hugely beneficial, especially in a time of crisis. And so even this little dog, this little stray dog has a profound effect on things. Similarly, Henry, the young man who I'm not going to give too much away here, but who does in fact end up surviving the fire and enduring a lot of loss, finds that he has some resilience and strength that he didn't know he had. I think it's really important to talk about climate change with kids because they can just look out the window and know what's going on. It's not a secret. We can't shelter them from the way the world is changing. And I've been real encouraged when I go to school visits by how really informed these kids are, young kids, and they feel a certain a responsibility to be stewards of the earth. It gives me hope. Every time I do a book tour, I come out feeling much better about the world.
And speaking of book tour, I had the absolute pleasure of being able to see you speak at Book People in Austin. And speaking of being a steward for the earth and the responsibility that people have, one of the things that you talked about in that tour was that you tend to write about things that make you mad. Maybe not so much, maybe not specifically about Wombat Waiting, but just in general. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you when you sit down and begin writing, how you approach writing, and also what stories you decide to start writing about?
Oh, I think that's the hardest part. Yeah, kids are always asking, "Where do you get your ideas?" And I say, "Just ask what if. It's the world is there waiting." But the problem is knowing which story you wanna commit to, especially if you're writing a novel because it's a big time commitment, and you have to love those characters, and you have to wanna dive deep even when it's a very dark subject. So, I have found that the books that stayed with me, the books I think that I had um more success with, and I don't mean in terms of sales, but in terms of telling the story I wanted to tell, involve things that I was really angry about. The most notable is probably The One and Only Ivan, because it was based on a true story about a real gorilla who was captured from Africa and stuck in a mall for 27 years in Tacoma, Washington. And that story just galvanized me. I was like, I'm telling this. This is wrong. I've written sometimes it's not anger, sometimes it's passion. I wrote a book called Home of the Brave that I'm so honored is still used in a lot of classrooms. It was quite a while ago, and it's about a Sudanese refugee who comes to Minneapolis, as it happens, where I am today, and has to deal with, language and food and culture and, of course, snow. And I wanted to talk about how brave that is and how remarkable and how resilient you have to be to do something like that. A lot of my books have touched on environmental issues. Otter is a good example. I was thinking a lot about endangered animals, how we're losing species at an unprecedented rate, and I wanted to talk about that. And I also wanted to hang out with otters, so it was a win-win all the way around. But I do think if you're struggling, as a writer, trying to figure out what to write about, ask yourself, "What makes me mad?" And sometimes that's where your best inspiration will come.
And you brought up The One and Only Ivan about a gorilla and the several books that came from that series telling the stories of other animals. You talked about Otter. There's also Wombat Waiting, a story about a dog, and even probably what people may know you most from who are of my generation, Animorphs. What is it specifically about writing from the perspective of animals, or in the case of Animorphs, writing with a heavy emphasis on animals and their experiences that attracts you as a writer?
Well, when I was growing up, I was determined that I was going to be a veterinarian, and in fact worked for one in high school where my job was primarily picking up a lot of poop. But I did assistant surgery and I did learn a lot. And I realized I was much more interested in the cognitive processes and the behavioral end of um, what was going on with animals. And eventually that led me to start trying to jump inside their heads and write stories. Animorphs, my husband and I wrote together, Michael Grant, and I was talking to him about this because we'd written a lot of packaged, ghost written kind of stuff at that point. We wanted to try something new. And I said, I want to get kids in the heads of animals. And Michael said, well, we're going to have to go sci fi then. And it was this perfect melding once we got going. It was hard because A, books came out once a month back then, and B, we didn't have the internet. This was a very long time ago, as you point out. In fact, we're hitting the 30th anniversary this year. And so research was rushed, to say the least, and reliant entirely on, libraries. So it would be a different experience to write it now, I think.
And speaking of Animorphs, a lot of times when I talk to people about getting to interview authors and children's books and all the great things that I get to do on this podcast, people that bring up Animorphs wonder whatever happened to K.A. Applegate. And of course, there has been a change with going from K.A. Applegate to being published under the name Katherine Applegate. Can you talk a little bit about, why you think that there may have been a push to using the K.A. as opposed to just Katherine Applegate for those earlier books?
Well, in part, of course, it was because Michael and I were working together. It worked out well to have this kind of separate name. I do think, and I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that uh, my publisher at the time felt, as many did at that point, that boys simply wouldn't buy books written by women. I I've seen many other female authors do this over the years. Now, if they asked me to do this, I'd be like, "Are you kidding me?" But at the time, we were young and foolish, and you just excited to be publishing. And I I've asked kids about this, boys about this, and they really don't seem to care nearly as much. I mean, it's like, no, it's got to be a good book. I don't care. So hopefully, we've made some progress in that regard.
And another thing that you talked about when you were discussing Animorphs and the process of writing that, you said that the research was rushed and you published one book a month. And a lot of times, people who may have known books like Animorphs, books like Goosebumps in the Scholastic Book Fair, which is clearly an inspiration for this podcast, there was a lot of people, a lot of authors that were getting books published monthly or semi monthly. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like writing at that pace and maybe why there has been a shift and we have seen less books released so quickly in the last 15 or so years?
And yeah, it's funny because I have wondered about this myself because now we have, the delivery mechanism to make it so much easier to get books out there. It may have just been of its time. A lot of it was there was this wonderful editor slash publisher at Scholastic named Jean Fywell who oversaw a lot of these babysitters and Goosebumps and Animorphs. Um, it is very hard to do. I emphasize we had a new baby at the time, and we were living on caffeine, but so I'm sure that's part of it. But I, for example, did 17 Sweet Valley Twins, another series that came out monthly. And in that case, it was with what's called a packager. And I was one of many, many ghostwriters. So that would be one way, just like Hardy Boys, one way that you could approach writing a series and keeping it going. But I think it was magical for kids because that book, I've talked to so many people. Maybe you remember this back in the dark ages. That book was coming out and you would rush to the book fair or you would rush to the library, the bookstore. You could not wait for that next book. And if you want to create eager, committed readers, I can't think of a better way to do it.
I wanted to go back to the process of writing in a time before the internet and your reliance on libraries. Of course, libraries still are a valuable resource, something that I cover all the time on the news segment of this podcast. And I wanted to ask you, How has the research process changed and maybe improved over the last decades since the internet has become more and more accessible?
Oh, I'll give you a good example. So I wrote a picture book called The Littlest Elephant, and it was preceded by a novel that was part of the One and Only series called The One and Only Ruby. And so I had to do a lot of research on, poaching, for example, and how baby elephants who are orphaned are cared for, and all these just little data bits that weren't that easily accessible. But mostly, I wanted to get the behavior right, the communication right. And there's this wonderful, it's called an ethogram. It's a behavioral list, basically, of a particular species traits. And the one I used was called Elephant Voices. And it was wonderful. It had little, video clips of every possible imaginable behavior. And you could hear sounds and you could get details on care. And it was invaluable. And one of my favorites was the scientific phrase floppy running, which is how they describe little baby elephants when they're first joyfully running and they don't really have control of their limbs, but things like that just weren't available. And so I'm sure back in the day with Animorphs there were plenty of mistakes made that I would probably regret, uh, but now it's just amazing. And the other thing I'm able to do now that I couldn't do then is I have the resources to travel. I went when I wrote The One and Only Ivan, I went to Tacoma, and I spent time at the mall where he lived and dug through the Tacoma Public Library archives. With Otter, I spent time in Monterey Bay hanging out with otters. So that kind of thing, of course, if you can do it, makes it all the more meaningful.
And speaking of The Littlest Elephant, when we were in Austin, my wife and I, we were able to see you speak at Book People, and we were able to get a signed copy of The Littlest Elephant. And for people listening to this podcast right now who aren't able to attend book events because they're in select cities on specific dates, and with work, it can sometimes be difficult to make it. Uh, we are going to be giving away a signed copy of The Littlest Elephant on this podcast. More on that later. But Katherine, thank you so much for your time. And I want to end this with the same question that I ask all of my guests. It's open ended, so feel free to use this to get your final words in, as well as just respond however you feel appropriate. Katherine, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Wow. That's not an easy one, is it? I thought I'd get a nice softball. Oh. Well, I see the fact that that I can write and that I have the joyous luxury of being able to write for people, especially for young readers, as just a tremendous gift. And I am extraordinarily aware that there are myriad writers out there who are more talented than I. I've been very lucky, and writers need to remember, and I'm sure there are a lot of writers or aspiring writers who listen to this, um, that tenacity is a big part of success, and talent is certainly helpful, but a lot of it can be luck, and I've been extraordinarily lucky. And the result is I'm able to connect with young readers, and when a kid walks up to me and says, "Hey, this is my best friend book. This is the book that made me a reader." I can't tell you how happy that makes me.
Thank you. That was an interview with Katherine Applegate. Her newest book, Wombat Waiting, releases on May 5th. You can learn more about Katherine and her work at katherineapplegate.com. That was an interview. That was an interview with Katherine Applegate. Her newest book, Wombat Waiting, releases on May 5th. You can learn more about Katherine and her work at katherineapplegate.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.